The unlikely encounter. The observation dome of Helios 7 station offered an unparalleled view of the Carina Nebula, its swirling purples and blues casting ethereal shadows across Sarah Chen's face as she adjusted her hydroponics array. At 32, she was the youngest cenobotanist ever assigned to lead the station's endangered species preservation program, though most days she felt more like a glorified gardener than a groundbreaking scientist. The massive space station hung at the edge of contested space, serving as a neutral zone between various alien civilizations and humanity's expanding frontier. Sarah's laboratory, tucked away in the agricultural sector, housed over 200 species of plants from across known space, many of them the last of their kind. A violent shudder ran through the station, causing the lights to flicker. Sarah steadied herself against her workbench, watching as precious drops of nutrient solution splashed onto the floor. The station's AI remained silent. No emergency alerts. Probably just another docking mishap. The massive Thanari warships always had trouble with Helios 7's human-scale facilities. She returned to cataloging a newly arrived specimen, a luminescent fungus from the Thanari homeworld that supposedly held remarkable healing properties. The species was nearly extinct, thanks to the Thanari's endless wars and industrial expansion. Sarah found it ironic that one of the galaxy's most militant species had produced something so delicate and beneficial. The laboratory door hissed open behind her. Sarah didn't turn around, assuming it was one of her assistants. "Could you bring me the spectral analyzer? This little guy's bioluminescence pattern is fascinating." A deep, resonating growl interrupted her. "Human, you will assist me." Sarah spun around and found herself face to chest with a Thanari warrior, even hunched over to fit through the human-sized door. He towered over her. His gray, armored skin was marked with ceremonial scarring, and all four of his amber eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. But what really caught her attention was the dark purple blood seeping from between the plates of his natural armor. Most humans would have called security, or run. Sarah noticed the warrior was favoring his left leg, and his breathing seemed labored. Despite their fearsome reputation, she knew Thanari warriors would rather die than show weakness to their own kind. Coming to her lab, away from the medical bay, was an act of desperation. "You're injured," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm not a medical doctor, but the human medical bay will not suffice," he growled. "I require—" He paused, mandibles clicking in what Sarah recognized as discomfort or embarrassment. "I require treatment that will not be recorded. My injuries would bring shame to my clan." Sarah glanced at the security cameras, then at the rare Thanari fungus she'd been studying. "Those healing properties I've been researching, they're not just theoretical. But I'll need to know exactly what happened if I'm going to help you properly." The warrior's upper eyes narrowed while his lower ones darted to the door. Finally, he spoke. "I am Karvek, third blade of the Crimson Claw Fleet. During our last campaign, He seemed to struggle with the words. "I refused an order to bombard a civilian settlement." The fleet commander expressed his displeasure personally. Sarah's eyes widened. She'd heard rumors about the brutal Thanari military hierarchy, but seeing evidence firsthand was different. "That was brave of you," she said softly, already gathering supplies. "It was weak," Karvek spat. "A true warrior does not question orders. A true warrior protects those who cannot protect themselves." Sarah countered, surprising herself with her boldness. "Now sit down before you bleed all over my rare specimens." To her even greater surprise, Karvek complied, carefully lowering himself onto a reinforced workbench. As Sarah prepared the fungal extract, she kept talking, partly to distract him, and partly because the scientist in her couldn't resist. "This species evolved in the caves of your homeworld, didn't it? The bioluminescence attracts insects that helped spread its spores, while its healing properties protected it from predators. Natural selection at its finest. You study our biology?" Karvek asked, his tone mixing confusion and curiosity. "I study life," Sarah replied, carefully applying the glowing extract to his wounds. All life. Every species has something to teach us, if we're willing to learn, even ones that try very hard to look scary and intimidating. A sound emerged from Karvik that took Sarah a moment to identify as laughter. You are either very brave or very foolish, little human. I get that a lot. Sarah grinned. And it's Sarah. Sarah Chen. Now hold still. This next part might sting a bit. As she worked, Sarah explained the properties of various plants in her lab. And to her surprise, Karvik began asking increasingly detailed questions. Behind his warrior's facade lay a genuine curiosity about the natural world. By the time she finished treating his injuries, they were deep in a discussion about the ecological disasters facing both their species. You should rest here for a few hours while the extract takes full effect, Sarah said, cleaning up her supplies. I can lock down the lab, give you some privacy. Karvik stood carefully, testing his newly treated injuries. You have done me a great service, Sarah Chen. By our laws, I am now in your debt. How about we just call it friendship? Sarah suggested. Though if you're really feeling grateful, I wouldn't mind learning more about some of your world's endangered species. For purely scientific purposes, of course. All four of Karvik's eyes blinked in succession, a gesture Sarah would later learn indicated surprised amusement. You are a strange human, Sarah Chen. But perhaps that is not a bad thing. As Sarah locked down her lab and headed to her quarters that night, she couldn't help but smile. Her mother had always told her that her curiosity would either get her killed or change the world. Looking back at the sealed laboratory door, she wondered if perhaps it might do both. Little did she know that this unlikely encounter would set in motion events that would reshape the relationship between their species forever. All because one human scientist chose curiosity over fear, and one Thenari warrior dared to show weakness in the pursuit of something stronger than pride. Breaking barriers. The next few weeks on Helios 7 saw an unusual pattern developing in the agricultural sector. Sarah's laboratory, once a quiet sanctuary of botanical research, began receiving regular visits from a towering Thenari warrior. Station personnel would do double takes at the site of Karvik carefully, maneuvering through human-sized corridors to reach her lab, his massive frame somehow managing to avoid disturbing even the most delicate specimens. Your fungal treatment saved more than my pride, Karvik explained one day, watching Sarah tend to a collection of bioluminescent flowers from a gas giant's floating forests. It made me realize how much knowledge my people have lost in our endless wars. Sarah adjusted the atmospheric controls for the specimen chamber. Knowledge isn't lost, it's just waiting to be rediscovered. Like these drift blooms, everyone thought they were extinct until a human mining crew found them thriving in the upper atmosphere of Kepler 186. Their conversations often went like this, weaving between scientific observation and philosophical discussion. But not everyone on the station appreciated their growing friendship. You're consorting with the enemy, Dr. Marcus Reynolds, the station's chief medical officer, cornered Sarah in the mess hall one morning. Those creatures bombed 3 human colonies last year alone. Sarah met his gaze steadily. And how many of their worlds have we stripped for resources? Progress doesn't come from holding on to old hatreds, Marcus. The Thenari weren't any more accepting. One afternoon, 3 warriors from Karvik's former fleet cornered him in the station's cargo bay. Sarah arrived just in time to hear their accusations of weakness and betrayal. You disgrace our ancestors, the largest warrior snarled, spending your days with a soft human female, discussing plants like some dirt tender. Karvik's response surprised them all. Our ancestors lived in harmony with their world before the Great Wars began. Is it not more disgraceful to forget their wisdom than to learn from one who remembers it? The confrontation ended without violence, but it marked a turning point. That evening, in the quiet of Sarah's lab, Karvik revealed more of his past. I was bred for war, he said, helping Sarah catalog new specimens. But in every battle, every conquest, I saw worlds dying. Not just from weapons, but from neglect. from forgetting the balance our ancestors understood. Sarah paused in her work. Is that why you refused to bomb that settlement? They were terraformers. Carveck's 4 eyes fixed on a particularly delicate flowering vine, creating new habitats for endangered species. The fleet commander saw them as an obstacle to resource extraction. I saw them as hope. Their unlikely partnership soon began yielding remarkable results. Carveck's knowledge of his people's ancient biological sciences, combined with Sarah's modern research methods, led to breakthroughs in preserving endangered species from both their worlds. They developed new cultivation techniques, combining Thenari traditional knowledge with human technology. Sarah's laboratory became a bridge between worlds, where humans and Thenari could meet on neutral ground to discuss preservation efforts. But their greatest challenge came from an unexpected quarter. Sarah's automated probes detected a disturbing pattern in several recently preserved species. Their genetic structures were degrading at an accelerated rate, as if something was attacking them at a molecular level. It's spreading, Sarah explained, showing Carveck the data. Whatever this is, it's affecting both Earth origin and Thenari species. If we don't find a way to stop it, then all our work, all this preservation, Carveck gestured at the laboratory filled with carefully tended life from across the galaxy, will be meaningless. As they worked late into the station's night cycle, analyzing data and testing theories, neither of them could have predicted how their friendship would soon be tested. The mysterious genetic degradation was only the beginning of a crisis that would force both their species to confront their prejudices and fear. But for now, in the peaceful quiet of the laboratory, a human scientist and a Thenari warrior continued their work, proving with every shared discovery that the greatest barriers between species weren't physical or biological, but the ones built by fear and misunderstanding. And somewhere in the station's vast databanks, security footage captured an image that would have been unthinkable months ago. A 9-foot-tall Thenari warrior, delicately holding a test tube between massive armored fingers, while a human woman explained the intricacies of genetic preservation with the same patience she might show a fellow scientist. The footage would later become symbolic of something larger. The moment when two species began to see past their differences to recognize something universal in their shared love of life itself. The crisis. The first signs of real trouble came 6 months after Sarah and Carveck's initial meeting. What had started as an isolated problem in their preservation samples had exploded into a full-scale epidemic, affecting agricultural colonies across both human and Thenari space. Sarah stood in her lab, dark circles under her eyes, as she studied the latest reports. Entire ecosystems were collapsing. The mysterious genetic degradation had jumped from preserved specimens to active biospheres, destroying crops and native species with terrifying speed. 3 more colonies have reported total crop failure. Carveck's deep voice carried the weight of countless lost lives. He'd been up for days, coordinating with his contacts in Thenari space. The High Command is calling it biological warfare. They're preparing retaliatory strikes against human worlds. Sarah ran her hands through her disheveled hair. And Earth's Defense Council is saying the same thing about the Thenari. They're both wrong. This isn't attacking just one species. It's attacking everything. Their laboratory had become a crisis center. Specimens from affected worlds filled every available containment unit. The once orderly space now looked like a battlefield in their war against extinction itself. Look at this. Sarah pointed to a holographic display showing genetic sequences. The degradation pattern is identical in every sample, whether it's from a human colony or a Thenari world. This wasn't engineered, it's evolving. Carveck moved closer, his massive frame casting shadows across the display. The timing is too perfect. It began in our preservation samples, specimens from worlds that had never contacted each other. Sarah's eyes widened. The preservation process itself. What if we accidentally created the perfect conditions for something that was always there, dormant in the genetic code? They dove into their combined records. Sarah's scientific methodology, merged with Carvek's knowledge of ancient Thanari biological lore. Hours blurred into days as they traced the pattern back to its source. Here, Carvek finally rumbled, pulling up records from his people's earliest days of space travel. The Great Dying, a period when many of our colony worlds experienced simultaneous crop failures. Our ancestors solved it, but the records were lost in the wars that followed. Sarah's fingers flew across her console, correlating data. Similar events in human history. The Irish potato famine, the global wheat blight of 2157. Each time, the solution came from introducing genetic diversity from wild species. But now we have preserved the last specimens too perfectly, Carvek finished. Made them too pure. Without the chaos of natural evolution, we've made them perfect targets. Sarah slumped in her chair. Everything we've done to preserve these species has actually made them more vulnerable. The solution, when it came to them, was almost too simple to believe. They needed to do the opposite of preservation. Introduce controlled mutation, allow their carefully preserved specimens to evolve and adapt naturally. But getting anyone to listen proved challenging. Both human and Thanari authorities were too busy preparing for war to consider their theory. Then we'll prove it ourselves, Sarah declared, already preparing samples. We'll start with our fungal cultures. They'd reproduce quickly enough to show results within days. Carvek touched one of his ceremonial scars thoughtfully. The same fungus that first brought me to your laboratory. There is poetry in that. They worked tirelessly, introducing controlled genetic variants into their samples, then exposing them to the degradation agent. Again and again, they refined their approach, watching anxiously as generation after generation of fungi either succumbed to or resisted the mysterious attack. Finally, after what felt like endless failure, they succeeded. A new strain emerged, resistant to the degradation and capable of passing that resistance to other species through carefully controlled exposure. It's not just a cure, Sarah explained to the emergency conference of human and Thanari leaders. It's a reminder that life thrives on diversity, on change, on the very chaos we've been trying to eliminate in our preservation efforts. Carvek stood beside her, his presence lending weight to her words. Our peoples have both sought to control nature, to preserve it in stasis. But true preservation means allowing life to follow its own path, guiding it without constraining it. As their solution was implemented across affected worlds, Sarah and Carvek's partnership became a symbol of something larger than themselves. They had proved that the greatest breakthroughs come not from isolation and purity, but from cooperation and diversity. But even as populations began to recover and tensions between their species eased, neither of them suspected that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. The crisis had drawn attention from forces that saw their cooperation as a threat rather than a triumph, forces that would soon test their friendship in ways they could never have imagined. Proving ground. The warning came in the form of a corrupted transmission from one of Helios 7's outer sensor arrays. Sarah was running diagnostics on the recovered botanical samples when the station's lights shifted to deep red. The AI's calm voice belied the urgency of its message. Unknown vessels approaching. Configuration matches no known registry. Carvek burst into the laboratory moments later, his armored frame filling the doorway. They're here. The Void Collective. The who? Sarah asked, already securing her most crucial samples. Biological purists. Carvek's voice carried a mix of disgust and concern. They believe all species should remain separate, developing along their natural paths. Our work here threatens their ideology. Security feeds showed 3 sleek ships, their hulls seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. They had disabled the station's outer defenses with disturbing ease and were now attempting to dock. This isn't just about us, is it? Sarah realized, watching the feeds. They're after our research. The hybridized resistance we developed, Carvek confirmed. They see it as an abomination. Cross-species cooperation goes against everything they believe in. The station shuddered as the first boarding parties breached the outer halls. Station security was overwhelmed within minutes. The invaders moved with ruthless efficiency, their environmental suits making them appear almost mechanical. "We need to destroy the samples," Sarah said, already moving toward the containment units. "If they get their hands on our research, they'll use it to develop targeted bioweapons." Karvek finished. Weapons that could wipe out entire species while leaving others untouched. But as they began their desperate work, Sarah noticed something in the genetic sequencing displays. "Wait, look at this pattern. The degradation we fought. It shares similarities with their weapons' signatures." Karvek's eyes narrowed. The crisis wasn't natural. They engineered it, tested it on our preservation samples. To prove their point about genetic purity, Sarah felt cold anger rising. They nearly caused the collapse of multiple ecosystems just to promote their ideology. The laboratory door sparked as someone began cutting through its locks. They were out of time. "The ventilation system," Sarah said suddenly. "Our resistant fungal strains. They're airborne when they sporulate. If we can introduce them into the station's air supply." "Their environmental suits," Karvek caught on immediately. "The filters won't be calibrated for something so specific." They worked frantically, preparing the samples as the door slowly gave way. Sarah's hands flew across the control panels while Karvek used his strength to modify the ventilation access points. The door burst open just as they finished. 3 figures in sleek environmental suits entered, weapons raised. Their leader's voice came through filtered speakers. "Step away from the controls. Your interference in natural evolution ends now." "Natural evolution." Sarah laughed, her finger hovering over the release sequence. "There's nothing natural about engineering diseases to prove your point. Life finds a way to adapt, to change, to cooperate. That's what you'll never understand." She hit the control. Karvek moved with shocking speed for his size, placing himself between Sarah and the intruders as they opened fire. His natural armor absorbed the first volts of energy weapons. The ventilation system hummed to life. Within minutes, alarms began blaring in the intruders' suits as their filters detected unknown biological agents. The resistant fungi, harmless to living tissue but devastating to synthetic materials, began breaking down their suit seals. Station security, led by human and Thenari forces, who had finally coordinated their response, arrived to find the intruders unconscious and their suits compromised. The Void Collective's ships, receiving no response from their boarding parties, retreated into deep space. In the aftermath, as joint human-Thenari teams secured the station and contained the fungal release, Sarah treated Karvek's minor injuries from the firefight. "You know," she said, applying regenerative gel to an energy burn. "For someone who claims to be just a warrior, you've gotten pretty good at saving lives instead of taking them." Karvek's mandibles clicked in what Sarah now recognized as his version of a smile. "And for a scientist who claims to just study plants, you are surprisingly skilled at warfare." "Maybe that's the point," Sarah replied, looking at the stars visible through the observation dome. "We're all capable of being more than what others expect us to be." The crisis had been averted, but its implications would ripple through both their societies. The threat posed by the Void Collective had proven that isolation and purism were dead ends. The future belonged to those willing to reach across the divisions of species and culture to find common ground. As reports of their success spread throughout human and Thenari space, Sarah and Karvek's partnership became more than just a symbol. It became a blueprint for a new kind of future. But even they couldn't have predicted just how far-reaching the changes would be, or how their next challenge would reshape the very foundations of interstellar society. New Horizons. The Grand Assembly Chamber of Helios 7 had never seen such a diverse gathering. 1 year after the Void Collective's attack, representatives from 23 spacefaring species crowded the massive room. At its center, Sarah Chen and Karvek stood before the newly formed Interstellar Scientific Coalition. "The Genetic Heritage Initiative," Sarah explained, gesturing to the holographic display showing interconnected webs of biological data, represents our best chance at preserving and protecting life across known space, not through isolation. Karvek's deep voice resonated through the chamber, but through cooperation. What began as a desperate solution to a manufactured crisis has shown us a better path forward. The evidence was undeniable. Worlds that had adopted their hybridized preservation techniques were showing unprecedented recovery rates. Species once thought doomed to extinction were adapting and thriving. But more importantly, the process required ongoing cooperation between different species, breaking down centuries of isolation and mistrust. The Void Collective sought to keep us divided. Sarah continued. They believed that separation was strength, but nature itself proves them wrong. Every ecosystem, every web of life, thrives on interconnection. The changes weren't limited to biology. Cultural exchanges between humans and Thanari had exploded in the past year. Thanari warriors now served as protectors of endangered habitats, while human scientists worked alongside them to restore damaged worlds. Karvek had become a symbol of change within his own society. His fellow warriors, once skeptical of his weakness, now sought his guidance. The Thanari were rediscovering their ancient role as guardians of life rather than agents of destruction. We stand at a crossroads, Sarah addressed the assembly. We can continue to see our differences as barriers, or we can recognize them as opportunities. Every species here has unique insights, unique approaches to understanding life. Together, we can achieve what none of us could alone. The vote to establish the initiative as a permanent interstellar body was unanimous. As the assembly dispersed, Sarah found herself back in her laboratory, now expanded and staffed by a mixed team of human and alien researchers. Did you ever imagine? She asked Karvek as they examined a newly discovered species of adaptive plant life, that treating your injuries would lead to all this. The massive warrior carefully adjusted a growth chamber's controls with practiced ease. I came here seeking to hide my weakness, he rumbled. Instead, I found that what others saw as weakness was actually strength. You taught me that, little scientist. Sarah smiled at the old nickname. And you taught me that sometimes the scariest-looking warrior can have the gentlest touch when it comes to handling delicate specimens. Their laboratory had become more than just a research facility. It was a living example of what was possible when fear gave way to curiosity, when ancient enemies became trusted friends. Students from across known space now came to learn not just about biological preservation, but about the power of looking past differences to find common ground. The Void Collective was still out there, along with others who feared change and cooperation, but they no longer posed the same threat. You couldn't fight an idea whose time had come, and the idea of interspecies cooperation had proved more powerful than any weapon. As Sarah and Karvek continued their work, their legacy grew beyond anything they could have imagined. The Genetic Heritage Initiative became the foundation for a new era of peaceful exploration and scientific discovery. Species that had once warred over resources now work together to preserve and restore life across the galaxy. And it all began because one human scientist chose curiosity over fear, and one Thanari warrior dared to show weakness in pursuit of something stronger than pride. Their story became legend, told and retold across countless worlds as proof that the greatest discoveries come not from strength alone, but from the courage to reach across the void and find friendship in unexpected places. In the end, they had proven that life itself was the greatest teacher. Just as their preserved specimens had needed to adapt and change to survive, so too did intelligent species need to evolve beyond their isolation and fear. The future belonged not to the strongest or the purest, but to those willing to learn from each other, to grow together, and to recognize that in the vast tapestry of life, every thread was connected.